No, the jam.
Sure.
Robert, when you're moving around, that owl will follow you around, that little thing.
Okay.
And when you're speaking,
Uh-huh.
it'll split the screen between the predominant speakers. So the witness and you, that's how it's
I'm supposed to be weirded out, but.
No, I just meant so when you're standing, you might not want to stand, but you're not good. Or you don't want to. Lindsay, maybe I'll scoot the podium around here, so if anyone chooses to use it, we don't have to go over your extension that runs by the.
Okay. All right.
I just don't want to move like suddenly one of us. Your whole. Something over your shoulder.
She just like that. But it's first, yes. I don't know. So innovation.
Just because I have a couple anonymous, I just wanted to check to see if Kelly Price or Chris Loris were on.
Who's gonna take on gold and see? That be first one.
So we are at quorum, so if you wanted to start, we could move ahead. It's 9:05. Everyone's ready.
planning camera. Good morning, and we will call today's meeting of the Vermont Criminal Justice Council to order. Our first business today before we approve the agenda is to verify that either present here in Pittsburgh or online that we have a quorum of those members of the Criminal Justice Council who are allowed to fully participate in this meeting. You'll recall that there are operating procedures, the members of the professional regulation subcommittee who have involved with all files of alleging professional misconduct for the council. They are sort of the neck of the funnel, if you will, for matters are presented to the full council. But given the fact that they are members of the professional regulation committee, they're permitted to attend our meetings, but not to participate. And when we do go into executive session to deliberate, the members of the professional regulation committee are not allowed to be in that room or in that part of the meeting with us, only the public parts of the session. So with that, Lindsay, if you could call the roll of those present, either physically here in Pittsburgh or.
Okay, when I call your name for quorum, if you could please come on camera just so I can see you and verify that you're there. Chair
Okay.
Searle, Brian Searles,
Here.
Chris Loris, Jim Whitcomb,
Here.
Glenn Boyd,
Here.
Wade Cochran,
Here.
Chris Herrick,
Here.
Aaron Jacobson,
Here.
Tim Lueders Duma,
Present.
Susanna Davis, Mike O'Neill,
Here.
Ben Herrick,
Here.
Kelly Price, Mark Anderson,
Here.
Sadie Donovan,
Here.
Cassie Burdyshaw,
Here.
Scott LaValle,
Here.
Chris Loris,
I think I saw Chris. Come on.
done. Chris, if you're in the meeting, could you just confirm and come on camera for a moment? Okay, oh, I'm back. Susanna Davis. Kelly Price.
Present. Susanna's here.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Sorry, so we're officially at quorum. First issue is agenda was circulated, the matter for us today involves Franklin County Sheriff John Briskmore document number 2020 OGD on criminal justice matters. We tested hearing the department whether a violation sports policy. If so, what that could have in terms of council response, the findings, guilt of responsibility. With a very minor addition to the agenda to begin with, that being to welcome and introduce the newest member of the council. Any other proposed changes to the agenda as circled? You will assume that the agenda with that slight addition is proceed under that. And Rachel Lawler, who is a member of the council, employee of the Howard Center, Chittenden County, and filling one of the slots on the council, or the slot on council for one who works on an ongoing basis with population experiencing mental health challenges. As I believe left the Howard Center and consequently he filled that slot, and supervisor at the Howard Center, Scott LaValle, agreed to serve in that capacity if the governor would appoint him. He interviewed Scott last week, found his interest in serving on council and his willingness to do so. We passed his name on to the governor's office. Just yesterday afternoon, Scott LaValle was approved as the newest member of our council. In the interest of time today, we won't ask you to tell us about yourself, Scott, but I want to welcome you to the council, welcome your participation. With that, we will move into the chief matter on the agenda for today. We are joined by Sheriff Grismore, his counsel, Robert Kaplan of Burlington, of the Burlington area. First, a procedural matter. Early last week, we had a pre-hearing conference involving Attorney Kaplan, Tim McManus serving as the prosecutor in today's proceeding, and Wesley Lawrence, who is now and has been under contract with the council since its inception to advise us when we needed independent, if you will, advice in executive sessions and the like. Part of what came out of that pre-hearing conference was an order or directive that if there are any procedural matters that wish to be raised about the proceeding or any aspect of the proceeding, that procedural matter be raised by end of business on Thursday. And late Thursday afternoon, we were in receipt of a motion from Attorney Kaplan on behalf of his client asking for a decision that the council recuse itself from participation in this matter. I won't go through chapter and verse of the reasoning behind the motion, but bottom line, the contention is that since our legal counsel, that is the counsel, the normal legal counsel, Tim McManus, who part of her job responsibilities is to work closely with our professional regulation subcommittee at both the investigative stages and the process of discussions at the subcommittee. that she is wearing the hat today of essentially being the prosecutor or presenting evidence of professional misconduct to us. And Attorney Kaplan argues that we are akin to the judicial branch of government in exercising our authority today and under the judicial code of conduct of avoiding bias or even the appearance of bias in judicial proceedings, that by having our counsel most of the time presenting to us that, one, we as a council cannot avoid an appearance of bias. And I think there's also a suggestion, I'm not going to bother to read it right now, but that we would just have to give more deference to her than, because she's our counsel, than any other evidence presented. And essentially, the contention that counsel will not be in a position to provide fairness to Sheriff Grismore. It came in Thursday. Obviously, the state holiday was Saturday, but celebrated on Friday. But let me assure you that any number of state employees were working over the holiday weekend on this matter. Kim McManus filed a motion citing case law that, one, of course, we're not a member of the judiciary, that we are an administrative body, and citing language, judicial language, that we're not held to that standard, but that rather we are required to afford fairness and due process in our proceedings. I consulted with Wesley a number of times over the weekend. I consulted with the Attorney General's office. We discussed within that office, and the opinions to us from Wesley and the Attorney General's office is that we are on sound legal footing to proceed today. Consequently, I have signed an order denying the motion to recuse and or disqualify the entire Criminal Justice Council from consideration of this matter. I'll just read in part from the order we circulated to the council later today or tomorrow. Respondent is entitled to a fair hearing. The council will adhere to 20 VSA section 2405, which is the Administrative Procedures Act. Respondent has been given an opportunity for hearing and has been provided reasonable notice of alleged violations. The June 20, 2023 notice of hearing included a statement of the time, place, and nature of the hearing, a statement of the legal authority and jurisdiction under which the hearing is to be held was provided. A reference to the particular sections of the statutes and rules involved was included in the notice, and specification of charges, and a short and plain statement of the matters at issue. Attorney Kaplan had previously sought and was granted a continuance of the hearing date. We're prepared to go forward today. But if there is any member of the council who feels for whatever reason that he or she may not be fair to Sheriff Grismore in this proceeding, I encourage any such member of the council to step forward and recuse himself or herself from participation. With that, we are going to proceed with the hearing. And in that pre-hearing conference we had last week, it was agreed that if counsel for each side, Kim McManus first, Robert Kaplan second, wish to give an opening statement to the council, with what we can expect to be hearing during the evidentiary phases today. They would be able to do so, but in the interest of moving things along, that the opening statements by each side would be limited to 10 minutes. And someone's going to be keeping time here, and there'll be some sort of a notice when you've got a minute or so, your allotted time left. Kim, are you ready to proceed with your opening statement?
Yeah.
Please do so.
Good morning, council. The council has not had an in-person or a hybrid meeting in quite some time. It's truly wonderful to have some of you here in person. Whether you are here in person or participating virtually, all council members understand the importance of today's hearing. Lindsay will be monitoring the chat on the Teams meeting. So if anyone participating virtually has any trouble hearing any of the attorneys or witnesses, please alert Lindsay so that she can inform us of that.
Do have one. Kelly Price said he cannot hear anything, so just, which for quorum purposes, Kelly Price and Chris Loris have both signed on. Kelly, could you just confirm if you can hear?
I am able to hear now. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, thank you. Not a problem. And in a hybrid meeting, we're going to have these things happen, right? So as long as we're communicating, that we can hear, that's the most important part. Today, you will listen to evidence and hear arguments about whether the facts presented to you support a finding that John Grismore committed professional misconduct on August 7th, 2022, in violation of the council's unprofessional conduct statutes, Title 20, Chapter 151, Subchapter 2. The council provided Sheriff John Grismore notice some months ago that when he allegedly kicked a man twice while the man was being held in the processing room of the Franklin County Sheriff's Department with his hands handcuffed behind his back and his legs shackled to a bar under a bench, that the sheriff's behavior could meet two different definitions of unprofessional conduct. His behavior could be considered a misdemeanor simple assault committed while on duty without a legitimate purpose, as defined by Category A offense in our statute. Or his behavior could be considered gross professional misconduct amounting to actions on duty or under the authority of the state that involve a willful failure to comply with a state required policy. Specifically, that he violated the statewide policy on police use of force. Both of these allegations, Sheriff Grismore was provided notice of both of these allegations. For a variety of reasons, the evidence presented to you today will only focus on whether Sheriff Grismore willfully violated Vermont's statewide policy on police use of force, which was adopted by the Franklin County Sheriff's Department. We will not be holding a mini trial on the alleged criminal conduct of committing a simple assault. Sheriff Grismore's criminal case is still open, and even though the council could make its own determination about alleged criminal conduct, separate and apart from the conclusion of that case, we do not wish to have Sheriff Grismore feel like he cannot fully defend himself here today. In addition to not litigating the simple assault charge today, Sheriff Grismore, through his counsel, has been informed that what he says today at this hearing under oath cannot be used against him if his criminal case should go to trial in the future. So how will you, council members, determine whether Sheriff Grismore violated Vermont's statewide policy on police use of force? Some of you are intimately aware and knowledgeable about the state's policy. Some of you helped write it. And some of you have maybe seen the title of it or have flipped through it a little bit. Today, we are going to walk our way through the policy. We're going to break it down in depth using the guiding sentence of the state's use of force policy, which is, When force is necessary to bring an event or incident under control, officers will only use objectively reasonable force to accomplish lawful objectives. During testimony today, you will work your way through the two main parts of this analysis. One, is the force necessary to bring an event or incident under control? And if so, does the officer use reasonable force that's proportional to the perceived harm to accomplish that lawful objective? We will review all of these terms in depth today. What is necessary, what is reasonable, what is a lawful objective, what is proportional. And then we will apply the policy, the test for whether the force was necessary, and if so, was it reasonable, against the events involving Sheriff Prismore and a subject named John Burroughs. The facts that you may use in your analysis must come from facts presented today on the record, not on any other information you may have had prior to walking in here today. You will learn today that when we review and analyze an officer's use of force, we need to do so from the perspective of an objectively reasonable officer, facing the same facts and circumstances as the officer in question. We need to insert a reasonable officer within the scene as it was and inquire as to whether that reasonable officer would have responded the same way. Would that officer have found that force was necessary? And would that reasonable objective officer have had the same or similar response? In most use of force cases, this is a theoretical exercise for the finders of fact. Fortunately for you all, you do not need to imagine some fictional, objective, reasonable officer or officers. We have two officers who were in the same room, who were working with the same individual, who were processing the same information, who responded completely differently to the stimuli of Mr. Burroughs' defiant behavior than how Sheriff Prismore responded. Not only will you hear from these two officers, but you will view the body cam footage that captures the alleged excessive force. You will be in the room when it happens. You will observe how the two other officers respond, and you will observe how Sheriff Prismore responds. You will see two deputies perform their duties professionally and humanely. You will also hear that Mr. Burroughs was really hard to deal with that day, that his emotions range from complacent and docile to explosive and aggressive during his initial arrest and during his time in the holding cell. You will watch his behavior, and you will watch and listen to the other deputies working with Mr. Burroughs, and you will watch the actions of Sheriff Prismore. And then you will analyze his chosen behavior with the state's use of force policy. This is not a criminal courtroom. It's not a civil lawsuit. This is an administrative hearing. So you need to weigh this evidence presented to you by a preponderance of the evidence. In law school, they would always tell us preponderance of the evidence is as if you have two scales. The evidence is coming in 50-50. If your evidence should slightly weight one scale more than the other, even by a feather, then you need to, if I move the scale slightly more than 50%, then you would need to find that Sheriff Prismore violated the policy. However, if you find that the evidence comes in 50-50, then the tie goes to the respondent. Or if you see that the weight is fully in favor of Sheriff Prismore, then you would not find that there's a violation. That's your level of how you need to weigh the evidence today. The state believes that there is ample evidence that you will find way more than a feather on the side of the state that John Prismore willfully failed to comply with the statewide use of force policy when he unnecessarily and unreasonably kicked a man in custody. He was handcuffed and shackled. It was unreasonable because due to his restraints, he was not an imminent threat to Mr. Prismore nor the two other deputies in the room. I thank you ahead of time for your time and attention to this matter. And I also remind you again that either in the room or virtually, if you have any trouble hearing when we're conducting witness testimony, to please just let us know so that you don't miss anything. Thank you.
Thanks. Tim, can I just ask, will copy of state water use force policy be introduced today so that we would have just one copy in the room while we're deliberating after the post of the evidence?
Yes, so Attorney Kaplan and I reviewed exhibits earlier. We have no objection to each other's exhibits. And one of our first exhibits is the state wide use of force policy. We have physical copies for members here today. And then during one of the breaks, we will email, as the exhibits come in, we can email exhibits out to council members on Teams.
Thank you. Attorney Kaplan?
Thank you. If you don't mind, I'll address the council from here. I'm here on behalf of Sheriff Grismore, a sworn and dedicated law enforcement officer who has done nothing wrong. Sheriff Grismore was then Captain Grismore. He was the second in command at the St. Albans County, Franklin County Sheriff's Department. Captain Grismore, on the date of this incident, had no obligation at all to be at the Sheriff's Department. He was there above and beyond the call of his duty. He was there to do paperwork and to assist with office tasks. On this day, now Sheriff Grismore was confronted with two inexperienced deputies who were unable to deal with a violent, assaultive, combative, insulting, and frankly, dangerous individual. The two deputies were unable to force this person to comply, to simply sit down and not harm himself because of their lack of experience. And you will watch video of these two deputies struggling with this individual in shackles, hands behind his back, and they are unable to control him. The video will show you that although there were two deputies there, only one of those deputies, the smaller female deputy, was actually engaged with trying to overcome the resistance of this combative, assaultive individual, refusing to comply with orders to sit down so that he wouldn't hurt himself. Sheriff Grismore, who was in plain clothes, was not on duty, was not intending to be part of any active law enforcement duties that day, came in to intervene to assist two inexperienced deputies who were unable on their own to control this individual. The video will show you that this individual threatened to assault one of the deputies, and that this individual, through his body language, was demonstrating an intention to assault one of the deputies. That Sheriff Grismore came forward to put this individual back onto the bench to protect his deputies and to protect this individual from hurting himself. And that this individual, instead of taking that message to stay seated, got back up and was preparing and trying to spit on Sheriff Grismore, when Sheriff Grismore a second time pushed this gentleman back on the bench. And the video will show you that Sheriff Grismore did not hit this person, that Sheriff Grismore used his foot to shove this person back on the bench. In the same way that a person would use their arm to shove a person back on the bench, Sheriff Grismore used his leg to accomplish that same maneuver. You'll hear evidence about how police officers use pivot points in the body to force people to comply. You'll hear about how difficult it is to get a non-compliant person into the police cruiser without getting that person to bend at the hips, to sit exactly as was occurring here in this video. And you will see that Sheriff Grismore intervened that this combative, non-compliant, violent person, after Sheriff Griswold intervened, became compliant. That this individual remained on the bench, that he allowed himself to be secured on the bench in a way that he hadn't when the two deputies were struggling to gain compliance over this individual. And how Sheriff Griswold's intervention affected the objective here of having this person sit on a bench in a manner where he wouldn't hurt himself without anyone getting hurt. So deputy got hurt and there was no injury to this individual. And that is what you're going to hear today. But Sheriff Griswold did it right. The use of force policy specifically allows police officers to use reasonable force. There is no matrix given to police officers that tells them with this fact, you use this mechanism. Police officers are put in the position and required to use their best judgment to make decisions in an instant about how to safely gain compliance over non-compliant individuals. In fact, Section 3, subparagraph B of the use of force policy specifically says that officers may use a variety of techniques in accordance with their training to gain compliance of passively or actively resistant subjects, included but not limited to techniques using their hands, elbows, arms, legs, and bodies. This policy specifically authorizes what Sheriff Griswold did here. Sheriff Griswold should not be here confronting this proceeding, but he is. You will hear the evidence, and at the end of it, you will conclude that no, what Sheriff Griswold did was not a policy violation. It was an effective use of force to safely bring a non-compliant, dangerous, combative, assaultive individual into a compliant position where that person was unable to hurt himself or anyone else. Thank you.
Thank you. David, you ready there? Was that it?
Yes, okay, for Kyle, introduce, you said, at the new agenda. Did you change or? Will you be swearing in? Meeting adjourned. Have you been sworn?
Good morning. Please raise your right hand. You swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give in the matter now under consideration will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under the taking penalties of perjury?
Yes.
It's okay with the council, I'll sit. Okay. Good morning.
Morning.
Can you please state your name for the record?
Christopher Major,
And Christopher, where do you work right now?
currently in the state deputy with the county sheriff's,
And how long have you worked there?
2 weeks.
And what were you doing before that?
Just before that, I was a girl deputy, full-time for Grand Isle Sheriff's.
And when did you become certified as a law enforcement officer?
Went to the academy in September of 2021, and I believe the final sign off was sometime in
Certification.
January.
Could you speak up a little bit?
Sorry.
To make sure that folks who are online are able to hear you.
Yeah, so I went to the academy in September of 21, and then I believe my final sign off was in January of 22.
And who were you initially employed with, when you were in the academy?
Initially, Bristol PD.
Okay. And then when you graduated the academy, who did you work with?
Bristol or so,
Sorry, after you finished the academy,
Yeah, so-
where did you go to work?
after the academy, I went to work for the Grand County Sheriff's.
And did you do your, continued training with the Franklin County Sheriff's Department?
Yes, I did the entire FTO training process.
Okay. Do you recall how long that training process is?
I want to say mine was a little over 200 hours, maybe. I'm trying to probably that number.
And then you had your full level 2 certification by when?
Sometime middle of January, I think.
Of what year?
22.
And did you work before law enforcement?
Before law enforcement, yes.
What did you do?
Construction, mechanics, carpentry, a little bit of everything. It was COVID time, so.
When you joined the Franklin County Sheriff's Department, did you work with, Sheriff Grismore then? Probably had a different title then, but
Yeah.
John Grismore.
Yes.
What was your working relationship with Mr. Grismore?
Normal working relationship. And,
What was the, within the structure of the department, what was your relationship? Was he a peer? Was he a supervisor?
he was my captain.
When you were hired, he was captain at that point.
Yes.
And I apologize, you were saying, what was the demeanor of your relationship?
Average, normal working relationship.
So no issues with the sheriff?
No.
Before the incident that we're going to talk about today, were you aware that he was running for sheriff?
Yes.
Did you have any, how were you aware of that?
The previous sheriff and sheriff at the time of my appointment and, Sergeant Captain Grismore held an office meeting to inform all of us that he was running for sheriff.
Did you have any issues or reservations about Mr. Grismore running for sheriff prior to the incident?
No.
Can we ask the witness to speak up a little bit?
No, I'm sorry.
Sure. No worries. If you can sort of speak louder than you think and maybe a little slower than you think, it'll help also with the folks virtually. And we do have good speakers in here that'll pick it up, but thank you. Okay. What did you do to prepare for today's hearing? Did you review any material?
Yes, I briefly reviewed, affidavit and, body footage.
Do you recall on August 7th, 2022, whether you were on duty with the Franklin County Sheriff's Department?
Yes, I was.
And what were your duties that day?
I was a patrol deputy assigned to the St. Albans town area.
And were you wearing your body camera that day?
Yes.
And did you arrest a man named John Burroughs?
Jeremy.
Mr. Burroughs?
Yes.
Do you recall why you were sent out to interact with Mr. Burroughs?
We received a call for a, intoxicated adult male that was refusing to use his parents' house.
So was there a crime in progress when you were called to go out there?
Initially, just out of control drunk guy, ultimately resulted in trespass.
Were there any other officers present with you at Mr. Burroughs' mother's house?
Yes, Deputy First Class Endelay, and then a short time later, Deputy Matthew.
I'm still having a hard time hearing you.
Oh, sorry.
You're trying to use your cop voice, maybe?
Yeah. We repeat that or?
You needed to repeat the last.
I heard it, but just barely.
We can also move closer in, if that would help.
Well, so this is quite loud.
Yeah.
And I don't know how that might be affecting what people can hear through the microphone, so I think we just speak louder, more better.
Let me just ask the witness to speak a little slower and a little louder.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just pretend there's somebody in the back of the room that needs to hear. Okay, how would do you recall Mr. Burrow's behavior, when you met him? Like, how would you describe how he was acting in his mother's home?
He was very kind of up and down, like mood swings. Very agitated, picking things up, putting things down, just constantly moving.
At some point during that interaction, did you need to use force with Mr. Burrows?
Yes,
And why was that?
we were speaking with him for a while to get him calmed down. Ultimately, at one point, we were able to get him to say that he wanted to go to the hospital, so we agreed to do that. And then it's almost like a flip of a switch. He went from being somewhat calm to agitated, saying that he wanted to fight me, and said that he could knock me out with 2 punches. And proceeded to throw 2 punches at me. So we got him subdued and handcuffs.
And did you have any issue subduing him at that time? And just to clarify, you said that he threatened you, is that correct?
Yes,
And that he might hit you.
Yep.
And then he took a swing at you.
yes,
And it was only once he took a swing at you that you then, put hands on him.
yes.
During your interaction with Mr. Burrows, at any point, did he spit on you?
Yes.
Do you recall when that happened?
I believe the first time was briefly after we got him in handcuffs and stood up, started walking out. He was on my right side as I was holding him by the arm, and he turned his head and spit on the right side of my face. And then he did it a second time as we were walking down the stairs.
Beyond being incredibly gross, to be spat on, did you have any concerns about him spitting on you?
I mean, obviously I didn't want him to spit on me, but I knew that we just had to get him into the car. We could deal with that afterwards.
And how did you deal with the spit afterwards? Like, what did you do?
Initially wiped it off, and then when I got back to the office, I cleaned my face pretty clearly.
And did you fill out any sort of injury report because of being spat on?
No.
What did you do after you arrested Mr. Burrows?
We arrested him on scene.
Yes.
We got him into my cruiser after a little bit of a struggle of him not wanting to get in. And while we were driving back to the office, I made a radio note and stopped with dispatch that he was kicking and headbutting at the cage and spitting on the glass. At which point I did try to get my script hood that we were issued out of my patrol bag, but I could not find it. So I just continued to the office.
So he was combative in the car?
Yes.
Is that correct? When you got, excuse me, when you pulled into the sheriff's department, and you were taking Mr. Burrows out of the car, what was his behavior like at that point?
Calmer. You know, I don't want to really say passive, you know, but he was at least complying for the most part with the orders and, you know, walked himself into the, processing room.
Oh, you said that he walked himself, from the car to the processing room. How would you describe like how steady or unsteady he was?
He was a little unsteady. I mean, I was still escorting him. I still had him by the arm, but it wasn't a forceful walk. He was kind of, I don't say moseying his way, but he was getting himself there for the most part.
I think earlier You mentioned, or maybe you hadn't, sorry, were there any signs of intoxication from Mr. Burrows?
Yes, from him himself, and then during our conversation, we asked him what happened at fishing, and he said he got drunk. And then he was trying to continue to smoke marijuana in front of us while we were at the house.
Other than his admission that he was drunk, did you see signs of impairment?
The up and down mood swings, the swaying, and just aggression levels, just that's an indicator of their sign of impairment.
Since you're back at the department, did you try to get a spit hood before moving him from the car?
No,
Why did you choose not to do that at that point?
he had calmed down and started to comply, so I just felt that kind of leaving his own devices sitting on the bench.
When you entered the holding cell, what precautions did you take while processing him?
Due to his aggression, and the policy that I was trained on, we were to leave them handcuffed behind their back, they were assaulted, and then place, leg shackles on their legs.
And when you were doing that, did Captain Grismore, Captain at the time, Grismore, offer any suggestions as to how you should secure Mr. Burrows?
Yes, we'd be reiterating to keep him handcuffed on his back.
And where is he standing when he said that?
He go away at the processing yard.
Was there any, do you remember, this is August 2022, was there any mask mandate at the time because of COVID?
I don't know about the state at the time, but in our office, no, it was not mandated for us to wear them.
Was there any conversation about putting on masks that day, given that he was spitting earlier? You mentioned that spit hoods were available to all the deputies.
Yep.
When were those handed out? Do you remember?
I don't know the exact time frame, but we got them before the incident. They were distributed to each of us.
And were there extras in the office somewhere?
I believe so, but I don't know where. I would assume probably in the supply room, but I don't know.
But you had one at some point in your bag, but you
Yes.
just couldn't find it.
Yes.
Now that you were back at the department and had the resources around you, did you put on any personal protection gear at that point to interact with Mr. Burrows?
No, not until MK arrived.
Were you worried at all that you should?
No.
After Mr. Burrows is secured in the processing area, where did you go next?
We went into the deputy room, which was right around the corner, and proceeded to start our paperwork. And
Was there anyone else, who was in the deputy's room with you when you started to do your paperwork?
Deputy Underlay and Captain Griswold.
And how was Captain Grismore involved at that time with you?
We gave him an initial rundown of what had happened, being a supervising officer, for mandated to report uses of force, and with him being there, we informed him briefly of what had taken place.
And did you inform him that you had been assaulted by spit?
Yes, I believe so.
And did Captain Grismore give you any direction about filling out your use of force reports?
Under the use of force, while we were filling it out, I asked who the notifying supervisor would be, and he had said to put himself down as the notifying supervisor.
Just remember to keep your voice
Oh,
up.
I'm sorry.
That's okay, because as we talk, it's
Yeah.
easy to put down. After you relayed the arrest, to Captain Grismore and relayed that you had been spit on, was there any conversation about putting a spit hood on Mr. Burrows?
No,
Is there any conversation about anyone using masks to protect themselves?
no,
At a certain point, Mr. Burrows falls down, is that right?
yes.
How did you know that Mr. Burrows fell?
We were typing initially and Captain Griswold was in the room and I believe he was the one that initially noticed that he fell. I would kind of lead on the room to help him back up.
Is it that you can see the processing room from the deputy's room? Like, how did Captain Grismore see that you fell?
Yeah, above where the computers are above, there's a TV monitor that's got the camera of the processing room on it.
Okay. So that's how he saw it. When you brought Mr. Burrows into the processing room, what did you do with your body camera?
So the policy that I was taught when we got there was that if we had somebody in custody, we were to take our body camera off, set it on the, there's a half wall there, and we would set it on that facing the prison.
And was it recording the whole time that Mr. Burrows was in the processing room?
Yes,
And so did it capture Mr. Burrows falling?
yes.
We are going to watch a segment of that video, starting just before Mr. Burrows falls down, until he is subdued. And then I'll have a few more questions for you. Okay. This is State's Exhibit number 2, body cam footage of Deputy Chris Major. And we're going, Lindsay, to 32 minutes and 28 seconds, please.
Can't take a step. Ow, ow. Can we sit on the seat? Ow. Oh, that hurt. What? Hard for? Oh, that hurt.
Can I have you some?
Yeah.
All right, let's take a step up.
Stand up. Okay, nice to meet you. Ow, wow. Ow. You guys got me dead close, man. That's your behavior. I just have gone 2 different ways and I don't want to hurt. I believe you. Okay, it'll hurt. Okay. That hurt. You want rescue? Check it out. I want to go to the hospital. We'll have rescue come check you out. I'll very myself. Okay? We're not gonna do that here, so. All right, come on, let's just stand up, okay? Breathe. Get right back. I don't see any blood. Don't try to make yourself bleed. Can I go 911? We're not gonna be calling. If you walk forward, that's your Peter Johnson. If you don't sit down, we're not gonna shop. I'll get back to that. Open it down. Sit down. I'll get the hammer in here. I want to jam it down here. Sit down. Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, I got him, he's speaking, three times. No, he gave me 3 times. He's so in trouble. He hit me 3 times. He's so in trouble. Tell him to get away from me, tell him to get away from me. I have to say, you just tried to do that, I didn't do that, and I didn't. Ow. Said, ow. Okay. 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 Can you get that off? No, I didn't need to get that.
We're just gonna go back through and review, what we just watched from your perspective. After Mr. Burrows fell, could he have gotten up by himself?
No,
Why not?
due to his hands being on his back and both legs being shackled.
Okay. Can you explain the leg shackles to us? Like approximately how long are those shackles?
They vary, a couple different lengths, probably around 16 inches, maybe 18 inches. I don't know the exact length of them.
Okay. From your recollection of that day, how far forward could Mr. Burrows step before he felt his leg shackles fall?
Probably about 1.5 or so.
And he clearly reached the limit, that's why he fell down,
Yeah.
right? Okay. When you were assisting Mr. Burrows to stand up, how responsive was he to your directions?
Other than the, stating of that hurting and stuff, he was listening to the orders to, kind of somewhat help himself up.
You were able to get him to sit initially, is that right?
Yes,
And then he stood up and took a step towards you.
yes.
And it sounded like he threatened you. Do you recall what he said?
Something to the fact of him wanting to smash my face in.
Did you take this as a real threat?
No,
Why not?
he was already handcuffed and shackled to the bench and there was space between us.
Did you think he could injure you in any way at that point?
No,
Not to be repetitive, but why not?
because he was handcuffed and shackled.
Once he stood up, and came towards you, can you explain to us, how you positioned your body, like what you were doing there?
Sideways off stance, one arm out to keep him back, 2 reasons. One, to keep space, because I wasn't concerned about it, but the thought of him, being able to headbutt is still an option, his head's still free. But also to keep him back so that we didn't end up with another tripping situation.
Excuse me. It sounded like you asked for a key. Is that right? What key were you talking about?
Handcuff key,
And who were you asking that?
Captain Griswold.
Where was Mr. Grismore? Where were you aware of him being when you were trying to get Mr. Burrows to stand up initially?
In the doorway of the processing room.
Okay. So had he followed you to the processing room initially?
Yes,
So he watched you stand up, Mr. Grismore.
yes.
Why did you ask for Captain Grismore to bring you a key?
So I wasn't wearing my vest, obviously, which had my handcuff key in it. And initially, in the time, I wasn't thinking, but I actually keep one in my cargo pocket, still to this day, but I keep one in my cargo pocket, and I was asking for the key, the sort of next line of detention of someone that's, acting the way he was, walking to the end of the shackles. I was taught on a TO to take another set of shackles, put them to the back of the wall and through the center part of the handcuffs. And what that does is it tightens the hands so that they're pulling on their arms before the shackles get tight, so they don't trip.
So the behavior that Mr. Burris presented to you, standing up and shouting at you, the next option in your mind was we get the second shackle. Is that correct? Did you consider pushing him back onto the bench?
I mean, just holding him there, but not as a solution for the duration.
So keeping your arm out so that he didn't fall down.
Yeah.
But you didn't think, I just need to push him onto the bench.
No, because he was starting to escalate. I figured he'd just stand back up.
And then it wouldn't resolve anything.
Yeah.
Captain Grismore, comes in as you're asking for the key. And from where you were standing, what did you see Captain Grismore do?
So I felt his arm on my shoulder, and then I turned back towards Jeremy, and he used his foot to kind of kick it in, having an area to set him back into the seat.
Did you hear Captain Grismore say anything before his foot touched Mr. Burrows?
Not that I recall.
Did you hear him say anything after he put his foot on Mr. Burrows?
Yeah, I think he said sit down several times.
Prior to Captain Grismore pushing Mr. Burrows onto the bench, what was your primary concern with Mr. Burrows standing up?
Falling and hitting his face on the tile floor.
Do you have any concern for your physical welfare when
No.
he's standing up?
No.
Do you have any concern for Deputy Underwood's safety? If Mr. Grismore was not there and you were struggling, excuse me, if you're continuing to have, say, trouble getting the second set of shackles on, what would have been the next thing that you would have done?
I mean, I would have continued to hold him back and ask Deputy Underwood if she'd get the other set of shackles for restraining. The process would still have been the same for detention.
When you were an arm's length away from Mr. Burrows, did you have any concern that he was going to spit at that time?
No.
Did you see any visual indicators that he was going to spit?
No.
Did you hear anything that might indicate that he would spit?
Yeah.
After the first, Captain Grismore first pushes Mr. Burrows onto the bench, what did you do?
In the moment I thought like, oh, I do still have a handcuff key. It's in the cargo pocket. So I grabbed that, went around to continue my initial train of thought of getting the shackles and securing him back to the bench.
And then what did Mr. Burrows do next? He was sitting down when you moved to get the shackles, and then what did he do?
He stood back up.
Was he saying anything?
I believe someone to the effect if I got that on camera or that's on camera or something.
And what did you see happen next?
Captain Grismore gave a second to get him back into his seat.
Was the second action similar to the first action?
Yes.
And do you describe it as a kick?
Front kick for the most part, yeah.
And did the second kick, where did that land on Mr. Burrow's body?
Somewhere belt line, central area, groin area, somewhere around there. I don't.
Were you able to see that kick from where you were getting the shackles?
No, not the full on kick. I knew the action happened, but I was focusing on the shackles.
Okay. So you saw his leg go up, but you didn't see it land?
Yeah.
You see that Mr. Grismore, is seated, detained, and has a spit hood on. What did you do after that?
Like after the second set of shackles were on and everything, we exited the bus or something.
Did you have any conversation with Captain Grismore about his use of force in the processing room?
Yeah, he stated to get our use of force reports done, to still plan down his notifying supervisor, and that he would do his and contact, the sheriff, as the sheriff would have to review his involvement.
Did you wind up reporting your use of force to someone other than Captain Grismore?
Yes.
And who was that?
At the moment, there's two people. We had an on-shift sergeant. There was technically the on-shift supervisor at the time. And I contacted him via cell phone and just informed him. And then I also, at the time, due to still trying to deal with what we're dealing with, I sent a text to Lieutenant Miles. At the time, he was our patrol commander.
And did you tell either of these individuals about Mr. Grismore's use of force?
I didn't spell out the details of what happened. I just said that him, myself, and Barry were involved in use of force.
Did you believe that your supervisor should look into Mr. Grismore's use of force?
Yes.
And why was that?
I thought it was unnecessary, as he was already detained in handcuffs and shackles.
And why is it that being detained in handcuffs and shackles made it unnecessary? Why did you feel that that made it unnecessary to use that use of force?
Also, I would object at this point to this question. This is effectively a lay witness was being asked now to move beyond his actual perceptions of events and now to either speculate or offer expert opinion testimony about use of force in this context.
Reaction.
Yep, I'm asking for why he felt it was unnecessary. I'm just asking for what it was that he experienced in that room, that he thought it went above and beyond what was expected. I think as a police officer trained in use of force, I'm not asking him as an expert, I'm asking him as a trained police officer.
Then I'll supplement what I said before and say that this is now relevant. That what you felt at the moment has no bearing on any fact that issue in this proceeding.
I'm gonna allow you to answer.
You just said a question on something.
Sure. Try to get it similarly as I asked, what was it about him being shackled and handcuffed that made you feel the force was unnecessary? Like, what were those factors?
He was already detained. He didn't have the mobility of his arms or his feet being, I don't want to say primary assaultive tools, but that's, yeah. That's probably there's a need for it.
All I have for you.
Thank you. I guess I'll stay seated. Deputy, my name is Robert Kaplan. I'm the attorney for now Sheriff Grismore. And you mentioned that you had no concern that Mr. Burrows would spit at you while you were dealing with him in the processing room at the sheriff's department, right?
Yes,
And Sheriff Grismore put a spit hood on top of Mr. Burrows after this event, right?
yes,
And at some point later, EMTs came to examine Mr. Burrows to see if he'd been injured when he'd fallen on his face, right?
yes,
And when they came, you removed the spit hood.
yes,
And then when they were finished, you put the spit hood back on Mr. Burrows.
yes,
And in fact, at that time, he asked not to have the spit hood. Correct?
Yep.
And you told him, no, you have to have the spit hood. Is that correct?
yes,
And then when you took Mr. Burrows to corrections to drop him off, he still had the spit hood on.
yes,
And you told the people in corrections that he'd been spit.
yes,
And in fact, Mr. Burrows was a person, in your experience with him that day, who had wild mood swings.
Mhm.
Is that correct?
yes, Ms. Snow.
Okay. And when you got to his mother's house, initially, he came in, he was almost immediately combative with you, right?
Mhm.
You say yes or
Oh,
no?
sorry, yes,
And you and Deputy Andalay tried very hard to reason with Mr. Burrows to avoid taking him into custody.
yes,
And in that interaction, Mr. Burrows would be, for one moment, non-threatening, right?
Yep.
And then instantly, and without any indication why, he would immediately threaten harm to you and Deputy Andalay.
yes,
And you took Mr. Burrows into custody when he stood up and tried to assault you.
yes,
And prior to Mr. Burrows trying to assault you, he told you that he was going to assault you.
yes,
And then he tried to make good on that threat, and that's when you took him into custody.
yes,
And when you took Mr. Burrows into custody, it wasn't just you and Deputy Andalay. There was another sheriff's deputy there, right?
yes,
Who was that deputy?
Deputy Matthew,
And the three of you were required to secure Mr. Burrows into handcuffs.
I don't think three of us were required, three of us were involved, but
Okay, three of you were involved and you got him into handcuffs.
Mhm.
Is that yes?
yes,
So then, after you stood Mr. Burrows up when he'd been taken into custody, the first thing that he did before he spit on your face was try to front kick Deputy Matthew.
yes,
Was he successful in kicking Deputy Matthew?
no,
How was he not successful?
Deputy Matthew, I don't know, I'll speak for him, but what I observed, Deputy Matthew was able to catch his foot and push it down and tell him no,
Okay,
or whatever he said, yes,
so his attempt to assault Deputy Matthew by kicking him was only frustrated by Deputy Matthew's quick response to prevent the kick.
Yeah.
And then Mr. Burrows spit on your face twice.
Yep.
And prior to this, when you had been interacting with him in his mother's house, you had learned that he'd just gotten out of jail.
I don't remember,
All right, well, let me ask you a slightly different question. When you were getting trained at the academy, were you trained in the hazards of people spitting on you?
yes,
And what hazards were you taught about that could arise from people spitting on you?
some type of, I don't know, just, I mean, there's an assault and,
In fact, when Mr. Burrows spit on you, he had committed an assaultive crime against you.
yes,
And you filed charges against him for spitting on you.
Yes,
And when you took Mr. Burrows out of his mother's house and brought him to the police car, prior to getting in the car, he kicked your cruiser.
yes,
And, you had to forcibly put him in the cruiser.
yes,
And you did that by pushing his head down and forcing his his pelvis to bend and his hips to pivot to get him into the car.
yes,
Because the hip pelvis area is the pivot point that you use to get somebody into a police car.
yes,
And then when you were driving to bring Mr. Burrows back to the sheriff's department, you actually stopped the vehicle to see if you could find a spit hood to put on Mr. Burrows,
yes,
because you didn't want to get spit on again.
Yeah.
You didn't have a spit hood,
not that I could find.
okay? And then when you got back to the police station, Mr. Burrows' mood had changed again.
Yes,
He was at that point not combative.
Yeah.
But you knew from your prior dealings with him over the last half an hour or so, that mood may not stay.
Yeah.
So you would be concerned that he would again be combative and assaultive toward you,
not really.
okay? When you got Mr. Burrows into the holding cell area,
Yeah.
what were your options for securing him?
With a combative individual, it was, as I stated, handcuffs behind the back and leg shackles to the legs.
And in the sheriff's department, there's no actual holding cell.
No, just as you saw the 3 benches or the divided benches.
And that's different than in other police departments where you've worked.
Yes,
Other police departments have an actual locked cell where you can put a person, non-compliant person into the cell and lock them.
yes,
And when you got to the sheriff's department, secured Mr. Burrows, you talked to Captain, then Captain Grismore, about what had transpired.
yes,
And you learned from Captain Grismore that he'd already been monitoring the situation on the radio.
yes,
And the Captain Grismore informed you that Mr. Burrows was flagged in Valcourt, the law enforcement system, as a person who's dangerous to police.
I can't recall fully, but yes,
And so you and Deputy Andalay started writing reports,
yes,
and those reports were affidavits.
yes.
And who was the lead officer on this?
Deputy Andalay.
Okay. Now, you were certified, fully certified in January of 2022?
Yes,
And that one you were working with the Bristol Police Department.
no. No, I was with the Bristol directly after the academy for a couple weeks and then left there and went to Franklin.
Okay. So by August, early August of 2022, you had effectively 8 months of road experience.
Yes,
And Deputy Andalay had been a law enforcement officer quite a bit longer than you.
yes,
But she had, prior to the summer of 2022, been a school resource officer.
yes.
And she actually had less road experience than you did as a police officer.
I don't know how much time she's had on the road prior to that. I don't know what she,
Okay? And while you and Deputy Andalay are writing out your affidavits, you become aware that Mr. Burrows has gotten off the bench and fallen.
yes,
And the concern at that point is that this individual has now hurt himself.
Yes,
And you, at that point, have an understanding that the way that you've gone about securing this individual while you're writing your affidavit has left him in a situation where he's able to hurt himself.
yes,
And he actually, throughout your interaction with him at his parents' house, including coming to the police station, have been talking about self-harm.
yes,
So your first priority is to figure out how to secure this person in a way that he won't be able to harm himself.
yes,
And you need to do that without also placing yourself in jeopardy,
yes.
okay? So what I'd like to do, if we could, is use the video. And I may actually need to use the mouse if that's okay. Thank you. So I actually want to start this video back at Mr. Burrow's mother's house, when you were interacting with him there.
Chair, I would object to needing to go back to the arrest. We've had a description of the arrest. Watching the video is going to be redundant. We've already said that he was been arrested. The totality of the circumstances that the council is going to be looking at is going to be the moments in the cell of what happened, what is happening in there. That is how the officer needs to respond to. We stipulate that Sheriff Prismore is aware that he was combative earlier during the arrest. He was just redundant and a waste of time to watch the earlier video.
Yeah,
It is directly relevant to this officer's understanding of the risk of harm presented by Mr. Burrows at the sheriff's department. What we'll see on this video is Mr. Burrows making threats in the same manner that he makes threats during the event that the council would like the council to focus on. And that the understanding of this officer, you've already allowed him to offer his opinion about why he thought force was necessary or not necessary. So I want to cross-examine him on those opinions by showing him video that will directly pertain to what kind of threat Mr. Burrows actually posed.
witnesses testified as to what happened at the house, including 2 spitting incidents. Ladies testified that he reported those incidents to then Captain Lismore. It's also testified as to the operative time in the sheriff's department leading to the interventions by then Captain Grismore. I'm not sure that it's not redundant to go back to the house for his own testimony or recollections of what went on at the house.
If it was relevant and useful to a fact at issue in this question for this officer to testify about what happened in the house, then the video, which is an objective record of that, should certainly be of the same relevance and useful for the council to understand what this individual actually presented as a harm, the threats that he made, his efforts to follow through with those threats, because in the moments in question here, this individual makes threats and appears to be attempting to follow through on those threats in the same way we did as the house. So seeing the video is essentially relevant to this officer's statements about what his perceptions and opinions were.
You can try and present the mediator in their case. I think it's redundant, it's to ensure that I want to move this along.
Okay, so we're gonna move forward to the sheriff's department. What are we looking at here?
Mr. Pirlo's sitting in the polling area. Like, again, shackled and handcuffed.
And would you agree with me that what we've just seen is Mr. Burrows trying to test the shackles to see if he can break free of them?
No, I don't think that was some kind of break free. I think I was just him taking it out. I mean, I don't, yeah, no.
So what we see Mr. Burrows still spitting, this time on the floor. Is that yes?
Yes,
And then he bangs his head against the cage.
yes,
So even though he's seated, he's still trying to hurt himself.
yes.
And right there, Mr. Burrows cries out in pain because he just banged his head against the cage.
Yes.
After Mr. Burrows falls on his face, he calls out that that hurt.
Yeah.
Now, as you and Deputy Andalay are attempting to assist Mr. Burrows to get him back on the bench.
Yep.
Captain Grismore is watching you from the door of the processing room.
Yes.
Oh, that hurt. What, hard for? Oh, that hurt.
And that was Captain Grismore we hear saying to Mr. Burrows, that's a hard floor.
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I see it. You guys don't need that cough, man. That's your behavior. I started going through different ways and I said, "Come on, I believe you." Okay, don't hurt. That hurt. You want rescue? I want to go to the hospital. Well, I'm rescue, come check you out. I'm very sick myself. Okay.
And that's Captain Grismore telling Mr. Burrows that you'll get rescue to come check him out.
Yes.
Let's just say,
And when Mr. Burrows says that he wants to kill himself, Captain Grismore says, you're not gonna do that here.
Yes.
And from your position here, are you able to observe Captain Grismore's demeanor?
Not physically looking at him, no.
Were you able to perceive any kind of anger by Captain Grismore against Mr. Burrows?
No,
Did he seem particularly irritated by Mr. Burrows?
not that I could tell by the tone of his voice, no.
On the video, we hear at this point, Mr. Burrows sucking in mucus into
Right
from his
then and
nose
there.
into his mouth. Yes, did you hear that?
No, that was him trying to blow his nose to make himself bleed.
Okay. Let me just. Again, back up just a second. So right here, Mr. Burrows stands up and he says to you, can I smash you in the face?
Yes,
And that was the same type of threats that he was making to you at his mother's house.
yes,
And at his mother's house, he followed up those threats by trying to hit you.
yes.
walk forward, your feet are shots.
Now, at this point, Mr. Burrows is in danger of walking forward and falling on his face again, right?
Yes.
And you would have been the person to try to catch him if that had happened.
Yes,
And you didn't want to be in that position.
no,
And so Deputy Andalay goes hands-on with Mr. Burrows.
yes,
And she's at this point trying to physically restrain him from moving forward.
she was asking him to sit down.
You mentioned before that you took a bladed stance toward Mr. Burrows. Is that what we see here?
Yeah, we just stand somewhat off to a 45 at him
And so that you do that for your protection.
for, yeah, distance and, yes,
And one of the concerns that you noted was that you might get headbutted.
potentially.
Deputy Andalay is not in such a position with respect to Mr. Burrows.
Yes,
And at this point, she is in danger of getting headbutted.
could be, but I mean, she has almost an arm's length.
It goes down the shot.
Now here, Deputy Andalay is much closer to Mr. Burrows than you are.
Yes,
In fact, her head gets very close to his.
yeah,
And this individual has already told you that he wants to smash your face in.
yes,
And you are arm's length away from him.
yes,
When Sheriff Grismore comes into the picture, Deputy Andalay has her face very close to Mr. Burrows.
yes,
When Sheriff Grismore comes into the frame on your camera, you are looking off to the side.
yes,
And then Sheriff Grismore uses his right foot and seats Mr. Burrows on the bench.
yes.
And Sheriff Grismore is commanding Mr. Burrows to remain on the bench.
Yes,
And your objective for Mr. Burrows is for him to be on the bench so that he doesn't get hurt
yes,
and so that he doesn't hurt anyone else.
ultimately.
Sit there, I'll have the hammer in here. I thought that was hanging.
So at this point, Mr. Burrows stands back up. Now, you have moved away from Mr. Burrows,
Yes,
and what you're going to look for another set of shackles at this point.
yes,
And you're free to do that because Deputy Andalay is not alone with Mr. Burrows. Captain Grismore is there to assist.
I mean, we just needed to move the situation along, and someone had to get the shackles.
You are free to go get the shackles because of Captain Grismore's presence there to help control Mr. Burrows.
Yes,
But when Captain Grismore uses his foot the second time to see Mr. Burrows on the bench, your focus is still on finding shackles.
yes,
Your focus is not on what Captain Grismore is doing to get Mr. Burrows on the bench.
yes,
And you weren't paying attention at that point to whether or not Mr. Burrows was trying to spit at Captain Grismore.
no,
If you're through with,
I'm just,
through with the video,
um. Perhaps.
I'm just wanting to get back to the screen so that you.
Sure, we can,
Members of the council.
yes, we can have the video go away for now. Come back to it. So we can approach. Deputy, I'm showing you what I've marked as exhibit 2. Or excuse me, exhibit B. What is this document?
is my supporting affidavit for the initial, call to the residents.
So this is an affidavit that you wrote
Yes,
about your interaction with Mr. Burrows.
yes,
And you wrote this affidavit and signed it under oath.
yes,
And you understood when you wrote this affidavit that it would be used in a legal case against Mr. Burrows.
yes,
And so since it's an affidavit to be used in a legal case, we want to make sure that it's accurate and complete.
yes,
And the information contained in here about Mr. Burrows' conduct, you understand, would be reviewed by a judge to determine whether or not there is probable cause that Mr. Burrows committed a crime.
yes,
And you would never want to say in an affidavit that a suspect did something that that person hadn't done.
yes,
And in this affidavit, and we've agreed to admit this, in paragraph 8, you wrote that while in the processing room, Burrows continued to be uncooperative by spitting several times and attempting to spit on us.
yes,
And that is an accurate statement.
yes,
And this is what you wrote while you were in the processing room next to where Mr. Burrows was being detained.
Yes,
So this is a statement by you contemporaneous with the events that were occurring on August 7, 2022.
yes.
When you said in your answers to Ms. McManus's question that you were not concerned about Mr. Burrows spitting on you, that was a different answer than the statement that you made in your affidavit.
Yes, as I personally felt there was no real concern, not that it didn't take place.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have. Thank you.
Just a few brief follow-up questions. And then, to clarify, when Mr. Burrows threatened to hit you and took a swing at you at his mother's house,
Yeah.
was he restrained in any way before trying to hit you?
No, it was not.
Once Mr. Burrows was handcuffed and shackled, did he pose any threat to you?
No, not that I felt.
Even though he threatened you and had followed on that threat at his mother's house, he didn't have the same ability in the processing room.
No.
Defense Attorney Kaplan mentioned that you had to guide Mr. Burrows into the car. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that you needed to use a pivot point, that the hip pivots to get someone to sit down.
Yes.
So can you explain how you put hands on him to put him in the car?
Initially, we tried to get him going himself, to which he didn't. So then we, positioned him on his side to get sort of his top half, or attempt to get his top half in, and then bring his legs in with him. Which is why he was kind of going in a little sideways. And then once his feet were in, he kind of set himself up and mellowed out a little bit.
When you put your hands on him to guide him, when you put your hands on him to place him in the car, did you say your hands were guiding him or striking him?
Yeah,
Your hands touched him, and held on to him until he was seated.
yes,
You didn't strike out at him to make him sit.
no.
Was there any big rush in the processing room to have Mr. Burrows sit right away?
As far as time goes, no, not particularly.
If he had stood there, and you all had stood there, how long could that have gone on safely?
I mean, it could have gone on, so to speak, for quite a while, but obviously not wanting it to, get him processed and get things figured out.
But he could have stood safely and not hurt himself with you standing there.
Yes,
Captain Grismore had not been present that day. Nobody else was there. Do you think you would have been comfortable getting those shackles on your own?
would that be, well, yes,
Deputy and the late president, the
Yes.
two of you could have handled that
yes.
situation. Last question, going back to the House. Attorney Kaplan mentioned that there was a third officer present.
Yeah.
What was his role, if any, in restraining Mr. Burrows?
His role, he obviously was standing back at the distance, saw him start to, get close to me and escalate, so I believe he moved in, and then once I had already taken him down onto the ground and we, taken his arms into a rear handcuffing position, Deputy Matthew had placed his knee on, I believe it was his right shoulder, just kind of keeping his close at all.
Okay, so it was just you and Deputy Andalay who took him, Mr. Burrows, down to the ground.
Yes,
And if Would you have done that without Deputy Matthew present?
So Deputy Major, Ms. McManus just asked you if once Mr. Burrows was handcuffed at his mother's house, whether he posed any kind of threat to you.
Yes,
You said that he did.
yes,
After Mr. Burrows was handcuffed, he tried to kick Deputy Matthew.
yes,
After Mr. Burrows was handcuffed, he spit on you at least twice.
yes.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Nothing very much.
That's it.
And is the video exhibit A? Right?
The video is exhibit 2. It's downloaded on the hard drive. I also have a thumb drive for the council. You need to review it.
And I know that both attorneys have stipulated to the admissibility of the exhibits that we shared with each other. At some point in time before the end of the hearing, someone going to move the admission of the exhibits, or should I just take notice of the fact that you have no objection and expect them to be admitted?
So I guess at this point, I would ask the council to admit all of the exhibits. And we'll present them as they're needed in the hearing. The council will get the originals.
Are you content with that?
Yes, we've agreed to accept each other's exhibits. We have no objections to them. So I think we just need to remember as we're raising them to, if we have a hard copy, to share it in person and or to share it via email. And probably on each break, we can kind of catch up on where we are.
One list stipulated.
We started
Process.
that. So we will finish that so that you have a folder.
I'm reluctant to admit them, and before we've had testimony supporting their admissibility, even though either attorney objects to the admission. Is there a motion to admit either of the exhibits that we talked about yet? If not, fine, we'll,
I think we can make a stipulated motion to admit state's exhibit number 2, the video, and defendant's exhibit B,
Yes.
the affidavit.
We
As
ask
of now.
if those be admitted.
both are. And we'll take no more than a 10-minute break right now, and reconvene promptly 10 minutes.
And if I could just ask before we break, do you think you need deputy major?
No.
Help today? Either go. You're free to go.
Hey, do you guys?
Just leave that there.
All right, so we're in recess for 10 minutes. Okay. I don't see nothing about it. I saw a video on channel 3. That's right. Yeah.
They're all- So.
All right, we are ready to reconvene.
Yes, and just a housekeeping question for the chair. I don't believe my direct will take more than 55 minutes. I know we're thinking of lunch at 12. If I end before 12, do we want to try to have a natural break there, or, I mean, does it make any difference to council if you start and then there's a lunch break?
Do you have a preference to do your cross before lunch, or if in fact we're close to lunchtime when the direct is done, or you take lunch break then and you start with cross just after lunch, do you have a preference?
I have nothing else to do today, so whatever work we do, it is fine today.
All right, well, let's see
Okay.
where we are at when you finish your direct.
Perfect. Okay, Carrie, you're gonna stand up for a moment. If you, you're just gonna get sworn in, and then you can have it.
Good morning. Please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give in the matter that will now under consideration will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, and the things and qualities of the truth?
Thank you. Deputy, if you could please state your name for the record.
Yes, my first name Carrie, last name Emily.
And we learned from our previous witness, we need to really project from there because there's a little sort of white noise coming from the machine, but that also is our audio, so we have to keep that on.
Okay.
So if you can just make sure to speak loudly as if to the back of the room, and slowly because we have, some of our council members are watching from Teams.
Okay.
Yeah, but you can just look out this way, they'll give this. Thank you for coming in this morning, Deputy. Can you please give us a brief background of your work in law enforcement?
Yes, I was hired and attended the Vermont Police Academy Level 2 Academy in September of 2018. I became fully certified as a Level 2 law enforcement officer in the state of Vermont in June of 2019 and have worked in law enforcement since in a part-time capacity. I worked with Franklin County Sheriff's Office from 2019 until February of 2023. And from February of 2023, I've worked part-time for Grand Island County Sheriff's Office.
And can I also ask that you speak a little bit louder,
Yes,
so that those who are not physically here are able to hear your testimony?
yes,
Thank you.
So currently you're with Grand Isle, is that correct, Sheriff's Department?
yes.
During your time with Franklin County Sheriff's Department, what were your various roles within that department?
Yes, I worked as a transport deputy. I worked on patrol and I worked as a school resource officer.
How long were you a school resource officer?
I believe approximately 1 year and filled in prior to that 1 year as a school resource officer.
And during that time as a school resource officer, is that the only thing you did, or did you also sometimes have patrol work?
I don't recall. I do believe I was doing some patrol work, but I wasn't working full-time in patrol. I was working as a school resource officer at that time.
In August of 2022, do you recall what role you had at the Franklin County Sheriff's Department?
I was working on patrol at that time.
And how long have you been doing that during that segment of time?
Following the end of the school year, so from June up until that point in August, I was working on patrol.
Prior to that school year, you had been on patrol prior to being with him. Great. And you said that you work part-time, is that correct?
Yes.
And did you always work part-time when you were with Franklin County?
No, I worked full-time hours.
For how much of your time did you work full-time hours?
A majority of my time with Franklin County Sheriff's Office.
Do you do any other work outside of law enforcement?
Yes.
What's that?
I am currently working as a pre-licensed psychologist for a private hospital organization.
What is pre-license?
So I'm not currently licensed at this time. I'm working to accrue hours towards licensure at this time.
Other than, so you're part-time work with Grand Isle, you do counseling work, are you working on anything else at this time?
Yes, I'm also in school working towards earning my PhD in psychology.
When you joined Franklin County Sheriff's Department, you said it was approximately 2018?
Yes.
Did you meet John Grismore at that point in time?
I don't recall if it was in 2018 or 2019.
Okay. But at some point you met him at Franklin County Sheriff's Department?
Yes.
What do you recall about when you met him? If you don't remember the time, that's fine.
I recall John Grismore was working in an administrative role at that time and was also a sworn law enforcement officer. That I recall.
Okay. And what, if any, working relationship did you have with him when you met him?
Other than referring to in his administrative role, I didn't have any other relationship with him at that time.
I think later on in your work, did that relationship change?
Yes.
How so?
So he became a staff member, and so I refer to him as a supervisor.
Do you recall approximately how long he would have been in the supervisor role for you?
I do not recall when he initially was placed in in my appointment staff role, but the majority of my time at the Franklin County Sheriff's Office, I refer to him from that supervisory role.
And how did you get along with Mr. Griswold?
I think we got along well.
In August of 2022, were you aware that he was running for sheriff that fall?
Yes.
How were you aware of that?
He had shared that with the office. He had shared that with me, and
prior to the incident we're going to talk about today, did you have any issue with him running for sheriff?
no.
Okay, were you working on August 7th, 2022 for Franklin County Sheriff's Department?
Yes.
And what were your duties that day?
I was on patrol that day.
Did you arrest a man named Jeremy Burrows?
Yes.
We just heard from Deputy Major and he walked us through the events of his arrest. I'm not going to replay the video, but I would like to ask, what did you review prior to coming here today to be prepared?
I reviewed the video in my statement.
So could you briefly summarize your recollection of what led to Mr. Burrows' arrest?
Yes, so we were called to the house to remove Mr. Burrows as his parents had requested him to be removed. He was reported to be drunk. We arrived on scene and he visibly was intoxicated. You could smell an odor. He was belligerent. He was threatening my partner. He was unwilling to leave the residence. We had attempted to de-escalate him. He then at one point had stood up, raised his arm to my partner, and at that point was taken to him on a city, placed under arrest.
Okay, and what was your role, in handcuffing Mr. Burrows?
Yeah, so I had, grabbed onto his right arm and placed him in that rear handcuffing position and lowered him to the ground. We're able to put the handcuffs on.
And when you say we, who
Deputy,
performed the restraint?
yes, deputy manager,
And you,
and myself, yes.
and what was it specifically that led to you needing to put hands on Mr. Burrows in the home?
Yes, so he had approached deputy major, and raised his arm to deputy major,
And I believe you mentioned it, but I just want to dig into it a little bit more. Prior to the use of force, did you try to use any tactics to have Mr. Burrows comply with your requests?
Yeah, I tried, verbally de-escalating Mr. Burrows. I'd asked him to sit down. Because of his level of impairment, he was up and down. At times he was willing to talk and at times he was not willing to talk. And then we had stood up and again approached deputy major and at that point raised his arm.
What training have you received, in use of force, law enforcement officers use of force training?
Yeah, so I received training through the academy and even after I graduated from the part-time academy, I received minimum 4 hours of training every year, as required in the use of force policy. Separate to use of force, I've also received de-escalation training and attended de-escalation instructor school in 2022.
Okay. Could you explain to the council, what is de-escalation tactics? Like how is, in relation to using force, like what is the role of de-escalation?
The role of de-escalation is to try to minimize or eliminate the conflict verbally and to avoid the use of force. We tried that at the house, which eventually then led to the use of force because he, with his level of impairment, he was it was very challenging to try to rationalize his who was that impaired.
Could you give us a few examples of what de-escalation techniques are?
Yeah, and so maybe it's verbalizing to someone, hey, can you sit down with me? I'm gonna try to talk with them about whatever the conflict is that they might be going through in that moment. So with Mr. Burrows, we didn't ever get to any type of conflict outside of what we were dealing with. But if the conflict was, I'm using alcohol for whatever reason, we try to talk about what that reasoning was that you're using alcohol for. De-escalating someone to get down to their level, sitting down with them and talking. Sorry.
No, I just asked for some examples, and those are examples. If it's safe to do so, why do you attempt to use de-escalation?
To minimize that use of force and to eliminate that as an option in this situation. The goal is to try to not use force at that call. But when we've exhausted every measure at that point and who became assaulted, at that point, de-escalation is off the table.
We're gonna jump forward. Mr. Burrows was arrested. He was transported back to the department. What did you do when you arrived at the garage?
Yeah, so Mr. Burrows was transported in Deputy Major's cruiser, so I met him in our bay. I assisted him and Burrows into the processing room. I had shackled Mr. Burrows' ankles in the processing room, and then we kept the handcuffs on. And then from there, we exited the processing room and went into the deputy room.
And how would you describe Mr. Burrows' behavior from the car into the holding cell?
I don't recall his behavior all the way into the processing room.
That's fine. If you chose to, shackle him in the holding cell, why was that done?
To prevent him from leaving the processing room. It is our policy that when we bring a prisoner in, that they are shackled.
And is it always the policy to have their hand cuffed behind their back in the processing room?
Due to the level of aggression at the house, we made the decision as to leave them out.
After Mr. Burrows was secured in the holding area, what did you do next?
So we went into the processing room and, there, John Brismore was at the office, and so we communicated with John Brismore, and at the house, and then from there, and Joe Mark immediately what happened from there.
Who was the arresting officer for this?
I was the arresting officer for this.
Okay. And so what did you and Deputy Major need to do once he was secured? Because you charged him, right?
Yes. So I remember placing my body cam on the dock, so that the video would be uploaded in case they needed to refer back to the video, while completing my affidavit. And then we sat down and decided who was completing what for the affidavit, or for the supplemental.
Did then Captain Grismore, advise you in any way about what charges should be
Yes,
processed?
yes.
And what was that advice?
So unlawful trespass, assault on a law enforcement officer, criminal mischief, and I believe a disorderly conduct charge.
Okay. Was this a discussion between you and Captain Grismore?
Yes,
Is that usual for you to discuss your charges with a supervisor?
yes, depending on the case, yes.
If Captain Grismore had not been there that day, what would you have done?
I would have communicated with a supervisor on this.
Was there another supervisor in the building?
No,
So how would you have gotten in touch with someone?
I would contact them by phone.
Is there someone always on call?
Yes,
But since Sheriff Grismore was there, did you ask him to supervise you, or did he offer to be your supervisor?
there wasn't any discussion on, there wasn't a formal discussion on asking anyone to supervise the case or supervise me around anything.
Captain Grismore was in shorts, a t-shirt, a baseball hat, like definitely didn't look like he was at work that day. Did you view him as your supervisor that day?
In a way, yes, because he was a supervisor that I reported to.
Other than, discussing the charges with you, did he, did you discuss at all your use of force report with Sheriff Grismore?
Yes,
And what was that discussion?
we explained the use of force that took place at the house that day.
And, who did you put down as your supervisor in your use of force report
Captain John Brismore.
that you had reviewed the
Yes.
incident? When you were in the deputy's room, did Captain Grismore, view the video footage of the arrest at any point?
I don't recall.
Do you recall relaying the events to him? Was there any discussion about putting a spit hood on Mr. Burrows in the processing room?
Not that I recall.
Is there any discussion about anyone putting masks on for protection?
Not that I recall.
How did you become aware that Mr. Burrows fell down?
I recall seeing, in the process or in the deputy room, we had a screen, that it is set up so that we can see what's happening in the processing room if there's not a deputy in there. And I recall Grace Moore standing, and myself and Deputy Major either sitting in the chairs or we were all in that area by the screen. I recall seeing at some point, Mr. Burrows on the ground from the processing screen, and Captain Grismer also mentioned Burrows had fallen, and so then we rendered aid to Mr. Burrows.
Okay, and who's we, who went into?
Deputy Major and myself.
Okay, and where, did you know, where was Captain Grismore when you went into the processing room?
I believe in the deputy room.
When you were lifting, we watched, the councils watched the video. When you were trying to get Mr. Burrows up off the floor, how well could we follow your direction?
I don't fully recall how well he was able to follow the directions. I know the Deputy Major and I were able to get him back to a standing position, providing that assistance to him.
Do you recall if he was able to get up quickly or slowly?
I believe slowly.
Did you make any observations about his ability to move while you were trying to get him up off the floor?
He was unstable.
And what was that from?
I believe the level of impairment is why he was unstable, but I don't know if it was related to an injury.
Were you able to get him to sit down after he fell that initial?
Yeah.
So just to back up, where you lifted him up off the floor, and then did he ever sit before standing up again?
Yes, yes.
And we can play the video if you need to. We watched it twice, so if you don't need to, try not to. But if you need it to refresh your memory, we can. Let me know. While you were assisting him off the floor, how would you describe his demeanor, his mood?
I'd say similar to that of the house, and recall he was still acting like again he was impaired, and he was impaired, and then making threats to the deputy manager, being belligerent.
A little louder.
Yes. Sorry, I know as you keep talking, it's easy to come down. I apologize. So at one point he stands up and threatens Deputy Major. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Okay. Do you remember hearing what he said?
Something to the effect of either smashing his face. I don't recall the actual verbiage of what Mr. Burrows used.
Okay. And do you recall where you moved when he stood up and threatened Deputy Major?
I don't recall. Where or when.
Okay, let's pull the video up just so you can see your positioning, because I just want to ask you about how you're understanding. You can go to 3414. Perfect, okay. So this is right after Mr. Burrows had stood up, and threatened Deputy Major. And so can you describe to us your positioning there?
Yes, my recollection is I'm kind of just holding Burrows, and I think at this point trying to prevent him from falling.
Now, your arms are on him and it looks like your elbows are pointing out. Is that right?
Yes.
And why are your feet positioned? Describe your, like, your whole body position relative to Mr. Burrows?
Yeah, I'm trying to provide stability for myself and for Mr. Burrows.
Because what was your primary concern right now?
My concern is he was going to fall again.
Your, from this angle, since your arms are bent a little bit, it looks like your head, is not too far from Mr. Burrows' head. What's your recollection from the day of, like, did you feel like you were really close to him, that you had space? What was your recollection in that moment?
I would agree that I'm close to him.
Because you're trying to push him at this point.
I want to object to many of these questions are leading to the point of being testimonial.
It's fine. I was just trying, I apologize. Thinking about time. My apologies. At this moment in time, were you aware of where Captain Grismore is?
No,
If you knew he was nearby or another officer was nearby at this moment in time, would you have asked for additional assistance?
at this point, no.
Did you have, what concerns did you have, if any, for your personal safety?
And at this point, I didn't have any concern for my personal safety.
Your head is arguably kind of close to Mr. Burrows. Could he have hit you with his head?
Potentially.
What movement, if any, would you do if he attempted to do that?
I would have just backed away and I would have taken hands off of him.
What indicators of aggression did you see at this point in time from Mr. Burrows?
Verbal aggression towards Deputy Major.
Did you have any, what concerns, if any, did you have of Deputy Major's safety at this point?
I don't recall that I had concerns for safety. Burrows was being verbally aggressive. But
What threat, if any, does Mr. Burrows have at this point in relation to the two of you? Is there any threat you could do right now?
I thought it was unlikely because he was shackled.
What, were you concerned at all about being spit on?
No,
Did you see any preparation that Mr. Burrows was about to spit?
no.
At this point in time, how much control over Mr. Burrows' movements did you believe you had?
I don't really know how to answer that question. I was providing what I felt like was more support to his body to prevent him from falling. And if he had taken a step forward, I think he would have fallen again. I guess providing that support to prevent him from falling.
So, number. Do you recall if you're giving him any directions at this point?
Yes,
And what was that?
I was telling Jeremy to sit down.
And were you able to get him to sit down at this time?
No,
When do you recall seeing Captain Grismore enter the moment?
when he was next to me.
And what did you observe Captain Grismore do?
He used his foot, to take Jeremy in the, running lower abdomen area. Right, and she was in a position.
And what did Captain Grismore do after he kicked him first time?
Initially kind of held his foot there for a second, removed his foot. And if I recall. And from there, gave a command also to Burrows and then.
Prior to seeing Captain Grismore next to you, did you hear Captain Grismore say anything to Mr. Burrows?
I don't recall hearing him say anything.
Mr. Burrows is seated from that first kick. What do you recall happening after Sheriff Grismore takes his foot off?
I recall the second kick and Deputy Major has stepped away from Burrows at that point. I don't know exactly where Major went and then walked between or positioned my body between Burrows and Grismore.
Do you recall how you were positioned relative to Mr. Burrows when Captain Grismore kicked the second time?
Yes, I had my hand, both of my hands on Burrows at that time.
From what you could see or feel, was the second kick any different than the first kick?
The second kick felt more aggressive.
How could you feel it being more aggressive?
I could feel the way that Jeremy's body positioned against back. It felt more aggressive than the first kick.
Because your hands were on him, you felt
Yes,
the force of the kick.
yes,
Object again to the question being testimony.
Did you feel any force when the second kick occurred?
yes.
You said that you changed your position after the second kick. Why did you change your position?
I had repositioned my body, in attempt to redirect Grismore, from that contact with Mr. Burrows.
Why did you feel that was necessary?
I was worried another kick was going to happen, and to prevent that, my hope was that positioning my body in front of him, to create some space or distance would eliminate that.
After he secured, second set of shackles, everybody leaves the room. Where did you all go?
So we had left and exited into the deputy.
Did you discuss Captain Grismore's use of force at all in that deputy's room?
Yes.
And what was that discussion?
He had explained that he would follow up, with his supervisor, which would have been Roger Longevin, to report this use of force.
Who did you report your earlier use of force to?
So I had reported that to, at the time, Captain Grismore, and then later, at the end of my shift, I reported the use of force, both use of forces to Lieutenant Chadwell's.
Why did you report your use of force to Lieutenant Miles if you'd already reported it to Captain Grismore?
I felt like that it needed to be reported to the patrol commander as well.
Is that policy or was that?
Yes.
And why did you report Captain Grismore's use of force to Lieutenant Miles?
It needed to be reported to the patrol commander.
Why?
For policy, but also, I was uncomfortable with the use of force that had taken place, and wanted to make sure that it was reported before the shift.
What was it about the force that made you uncomfortable?
It, the use of force felt aggressive, it felt unsafe.
When you were preparing for today and reviewing, your statement, you said you reviewed us, affidavit. Is that a sworn statement?
My sponsor.
Do you remember which sworn statement? Because there's actually two.
Do not.
Was it the sworn statement that I shared with you?
Yes.
It's going to be different. Yeah. That's okay. That's all.
Good morning. I'm Robert Kaplan, I'm the attorney for Sheriff Grismore. So I just want to be clear about the timeline of your experience. You were certified part-time in 2018?
Yes.
Were you ever certified full-time?
No.
So even though you were working full-time hours, you've never actually had a full-time certification?
No.
Is that incorrect or correct?
No, that is correct. Yes.
Okay. And in 2022, prior to June, you were working as a school resource officer.
Yes.
And that was sort of your primary assignment while you were with the Franklin County Sheriff's Department.
Yes.
And between June of 2022, when the school resource officer assignment ended, and August 7th of 2022, you had switched to doing regular patrol.
Yes.
And that was not something that you usually did.
No. No. Yes, that's correct.
And even between June of 2022 and August 7th, 2022, you were still part-time.
Yes.
And so you and Deputy Major get dispatched to Jeremy Burrows' mother's house. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And Jeremy Burrows was almost immediately combative with you.
I wouldn't necessarily immediately, I wouldn't say immediately combative. I would say he was unwilling to follow our commands.
Do you remember him ripping off his shirt shortly after he entered the residence?
Yes.
And you remember him saying threatening things shortly after he entered the
Yes.
residence? And your objective at that point was essentially to solve this family problem.
No, the goal was to get him out of the residence.
Because his mother wanted him out of the residence
Yes.
because he was drunk and out of control.
Yes.
And what you were trying to do was find some safe and peaceful way to get him out of his mother's house.
Initially, yes.
And you had him sit with you at a kitchen table to say yes or no.
Yes.
And he was at points compliant with you.
Yes.
And then he stood up from where he'd been seated at the table and started making threats to Deputy Major.
Yes.
And after making those threats, he actually tried to swing at Deputy Major.
Yes.
And that's when you took him into custody.
Yes.
And then after he was taken into custody, he was in handcuffs.
Yes.
And you stood him back up.
Yes.
And at that point, he tried to use his foot to kick Deputy Matthews.
Yes.
And he then spit on Deputy Major
Yes.
more than one time.
I don't recall more than one time, but I do know that he spit at least once, yes.
And he was not compliant about getting into the police car.
Correct, yes.
And you and Deputy Major had to use force to get him into the police car.
Yes,
And you learned from Deputy Major that after Mr. Burrows was forced into the police car, that he was combative inside the police car.
yes,
That he was kicking the cage
yes.
and he was spitting on the plexiglass.
I don't recall that.
Do you recall Deputy Major at one point stopping on the road between Mr. Burrows' house and the sheriff's department?
Yes.
Do you know why Deputy Major stopped?
I don't fully recall. I know that part of the reason was because he was kicking the cage.
Okay. And then, when Mr. Burrows was brought to the sheriff's department, you and Deputy Major took him out of the vehicle and brought him into the processing area.
Yes,
And the sheriff's department doesn't have, actual holding cells.
yes,
All that exists is a bench with dividers.
yes,
And so for a challenging person like Mr. Burrows, the objective is to keep him on the bench.
yes,
And in this case, he was secured with leg shackles, but still free to get up from the bench.
yes,
And effectively, in using that technique to hold Mr. Burrows in the holding area, you had left him vulnerable to hurting himself.
I had to complete my paperwork for the case, so no matter what, I had to leave him in the processing room.
The way that you left him in the processing room allowed him to fall on his face.
Would disagree with that. That's what I was trained to do when the person was combative or again, to prevent them from fleeing from the processing room. That is the way that I've been trained to place them in the processing room that we have at the time.
So in following your training, you secured Mr. Burrows' legs to the bench using shackles.
Correct.
And you left his hands handcuffed behind his back. Correct?
Yes,
And that execution of strategy, according to your training, allowed Mr. Burrows to stand up and then fall on his face.
I don't know how to answer that question.
Well, did Mr. Burrows stand up and fall on his face?
Yes, he did.
Did he stand up and fall on his face after you had shackled his legs to the bench?
Yes,
Did he fall on his face after you had left the room?
yes,
Did you discover that day there was another way to secure Mr. Burrows in which you would not be able to stand up and fall on his face?
yes, we had changed the positioning of how we shackled him.
Did you not know before that day that there was another way to secure Mr. Burrows to the bench so that he couldn't get up and fall on his face?
I was aware that there was another way.
Okay. And so you Deputy Major went into the process, into the deputy's room to start working on your affidavit,
Yeah,
right? Because the intention at this point was to present a criminal charge against Mr. Burrows to the state's attorney.
yes,
And the criminal charge, one of the criminal charges was an assault on a law enforcement officer with bodily fluids.
yes,
Because when he spat on Deputy Major, that was a crime,
correct.
an assaulted. And so when you learned that Mr. Burrows had fallen on his face in the processing room, you, the Deputy Major, returned to the processing room to give assistance to Mr. Burrows.
Correct.
And at this point, your objective is to ensure that Mr. Burrows is not able to hurt himself by falling on his face again.
Yes.
So at this point, I want to get into the video, which may take more than 10 minutes. I don't know if you want me to start or or just wait, stop now, come back. Happens.
I think whatever makes sense for doing the cross, it's really up to the council as far as whether to interrupt in the middle, at what point in the middle, if there are sensitive.
All right, we need to take the video down in order for the other council members to see us.
And they can see you, like, Lindsay, throughout the whole time.
All right, then we will take a break for lunch right now. I think it's, yes, it's here for us. Okay, and let's try to expeditiously have lunch and hopefully reconvene, no later than 12:30.
Okay.
All right, so we're in recess.
Welcome.